Mhm. Accélère, accélère! Oui, il va aller la chercher. Ne lâche pas la victoire de Pierre Gasly.
This is the DRS train.
Bienvenue au DRS Train podcast. Avec moi, Peter Brook, Nav F1 et Nedzo. And hopefully you recognize that, but that was the iconic French commentary of Pierre Gasly's win at the 2020 Italian Grand Prix. And today, we're going to indulge in every Englishman's favourite pastime and talk about the French. But more specifically, France's role and contribution to Formula One. Because I would say it counts certainly as one of the big four nations, if you consider that to be France, Britain, Italy, and Germany. That was certainly the case in the 1960s. But yeah, the closest thing we have to a Frenchman here is Nav, so maybe I'll just hand over to him to give a bit of perspective on France in Formula One.
Yeah, so firstly, that was really good. That introduction was really good. The accent was on point, so good job. I'm very proud of my contribution to this podcast. And secondly, yeah, so France and Formula One, they've always had a long-standing relationship. But if anyone is between the age of, I would say, 17 to 27, they might not have a lot of memories of France in Formula One other than the circuit, because there were no drivers who were incredibly good. The older part of this age frame I gave might remember Olivier Panis, Jean Alesi, and the younger people might know well Gasly, Ocon, Grosjean, but there were no incredible drivers, and indeed Alain Prost is somehow their only world champion, and there have only been 14 race winners, I believe, and a lot of those race winners were one-off winners: Beltoise, Ocon, Gasly, Alesi somehow. But to really understand how close France and Formula One is, you need to look at the very start of it in the 1950s, which a lot of people don't know about. Fortunately, we have an expert on the 1950s. God knows why he has chosen to know a lot about the 1950s, because he was born, honestly, probably 12 years ago. Well, he looks like that. Nedzo, can you please tell us how it all started for France's relationship with Formula One? Because teams like Bugatti did have a place in Formula One at some point.
Yeah. For your information, I was born in 2004, not 2013, as you're suggesting. But
wow.
yeah. But essentially, yeah. At the start of when the Formula One World Championship first became codified as a World Championship in 1950, there were before that year. There was Formula One itself was codified as a formula, because that's what essentially Formula One is. It's not a championship; it's a formula of cars. It was formed in 1946, but the first time we had a championship was 1950. And at the start, there were two major French manufacturers / teams. One was called Talbot Lago, the other one was called Gordini, and Talbot actually decided to pull out after 1950 because essentially, I think, like a lot of the pre-war teams like your Alfa Romeos, your Ferraris, they were essentially using repurposed pre-war machines. But Talbot had fallen out of favor in the late 1930s, even then. So they realized that their 1950 car was mostly uncompetitive, so they pulled out after one season. They did get a couple of podiums. Louis Rosier, he got a couple of podiums in, I think France and Switzerland ring a bell. Maybe it was a different race, but maybe different races. But yeah, they did that, and then Gordini kind of took the baton from them as you move through to the rest of the early and mid 50s. They actually oversaw the development of the first, not golden era per se, but the first kind of era of French drivers. There were the guys who'd overstayed from the first part of the war. Rosier, I mentioned, was a pre-war driver. You had Philippe Etoncelan, who was I think he's in the top 5 or top 10 oldest drivers in F1 history. I think he made his last start at 54, which is ridiculously old. Obviously, I think he's one of the only drivers born in the 19th century. And overall, there were just Gordini brought along the likes of Robert Manzon, Jean Berrat, and Maurice Trintignant. Berrat and Trintignant were obviously the two were more well known of those two. Trintignant, the only Grand Prix winner, he won Monaco twice in 1955 and 58. And I mean, Berra was ironically the better driver, despite having less wins and less overall success. But yeah, him and Trintignant kind of carried the flag for France in the 1950 on the drivers in the 1950s on the drivers front. But after 1956, Gordini pulled out. I mean, in 1956, you also had Bugatti dipped their toes in. They tried to make a car, but it was uncompetitive. They did one race with Trintignant, and it was awful. So they decided to pull out. And then towards the end of the 1950s, Jean Berra decided he was going to be one of the first drivers to actually make his own team. Like obviously towards the 60s and 70s, you had guys like Jack Brabham, Bruce McLaren, Graham Hill, John Surtees, all making their own teams. But Jean Berra was one of the first drivers to actually produce and make this phenomenon. Along with Eugenio Castellotti, he ran custom Coopers, I think, or privateer Coopers, should I say. Berra basically ran the Porsche Works team before the Porsche Works team was a proper thing. And then even when it was a thing, decided to carry on. He and Maria Teresa de Filippis, the first woman in F1, ran cars until Berra died at the 1959 German Grand Prix. He crashed out on the banking on the Nord curve, the big brick wall of death. Yeah. So there's a lot to go through on the 1950s. As I said, the big drivers. Manzon got 2 podiums. Rosier got 2 podiums. Trintignant, I'm not sure how many podiums he got other than his 2 Monaco wins. And Berra had about 9 or 10 podiums as well. So they had a couple of decent drivers. You had your odd point scorers, like I think in the first ever Formula One race at Britain in 1950. You had Eugène Chabot, Yves Girard Cabantou, people like that, Elie Bayol, who kind of got the odd point scorer here and there. But for the most part, it was Berra, Trintignant, and Manzon were the holy trinity of French Grand Prix. On to you, Nav.
And somehow, the reason why there weren't any scintillating French drivers or a scintillating French works team was because while Italy had Alfa Romeo, Maserati, and then later Ferrari, Germany had Mercedes, France was meant to have a works team called CTA, short for the Centre d'études techniques de l'automobile et du cycle, which means the technical study center for automobiles and cycles. And they tried to make the CTA F1 car between 1947 and 1949 to enter in 1950, but the car was just shit. Shock, the French tried to make a car and it's bad. Where have we seen that again? So because of that, they never had this team that was meant to rival Alfa Romeo, and the French drivers who were trying to get into the sport in 1950, a sport where, you know, the governing body, FIA, stands for Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile. Grand Prix is obviously a French term. You would have expected more French drivers to shine in those early days, but they were mostly entering with cars like, as you said, Gordini, Simca, Talbot. And Gordini went on in the 70s to become part of Renault's sport division. So nowadays, Gordini is a part of Renault. Not really very active because Alpine has taken over as the sports flagship of Renault. But that was a big issue for France at that point. Everyone was expecting more from them in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, one thing I will just add, because you said about how in the early years they weren't really there. It's ironic, actually, because the reason why all of the terms like the Fédération Internationale d'Automobile and the Grand Prix is because the first ever Grand Prix was held in France in 1906, won by a Hungarian, Ferenc Skiz, I think his name was. I don't know how to pronounce Hungarian names, surprisingly. He won that race by... I think he won that race by 45 minutes, but he won it despite going through a potato field by accident because he took a wrong turn. But yeah, the first ever road race even that wasn't called a Grand Prix was, I think, between Paris and Bordeaux or Paris and Rouen in 1894. They all like France in itself was they were one of the pioneers, more so than Italy, more so than Britain. Britain and Italy were late to the party. I could argue that France and maybe America were the two ones that really codified the sport of motor racing in the late 19th century. And then the teams like your teams that no longer exist, the ones in the 1920s, 30s, the Dion Boutons, your Delage, the teams that never got to the 1950s because they weren't advanced enough. That it surprises me that France were the ones to not invent motor racing, but they were ones to codify it and make it a big thing, like Britain did or England did with football. And now England aren't the best at football. France aren't the best or weren't the best when it came to winning Formula One races.
And to put Peter back into the equation, because you guys might have forgotten that he was here after his scintillating intro. What did you think of the first French circuits that we had? So Reims and Rouen were the pioneers for numerous French circuits we had in Formula One. But what are your thoughts on those initial layouts at the time?
I mean, they're quite interesting because the early F1 circuits were basically street circuits, mostly. I mean, they had the first actual purpose-built circuit. It's called Montlhéry, I think, and it's on the outskirts of Paris. That was built in 1925. That was the first proper circuit in the country because, again, Le Sart for Le Mans, that's a street circuit. But yeah, so the first one in F1 was Ronsgueur, which these days is famous because even though it closed down in the 1970s, the original grandstands, garages, and timing towers still exist and are preserved exactly as they were left. And they're just by the road, and you can drive right past them and look at them. That circuit was it was a very open, flat circuit with several very long straights. Quite dangerous because it was very fast. I mean, there were at least 3 fatal accidents there during its time. But there were also races. The 1952 race at that circuit became known as the race of the century because basically there were 53 even. Yeah, because that was what it was. It was Fangio, Hawthorne, Farina, Gonzalez, I think, with 4 drivers just fighting for the lead for basically the entire race. And it was Hawthorne that won it just. So that one has become notable for that, and also it was the race where we saw the debut of the Mercedes Streamliner in 1954. So that the next one they had was Rouen-les-Essarts, which was another street circuit. That one was built basically on a in between a meander of the Seine River, so very hilly forested area. Had a very, very sharp hairpin at one end. This one, again, is mostly famous because it was in 1968 that Joe Schlesser died there in his magnesium-bodied Honda, which just burst into white-hot flames. Again, that circuit not used for racing anymore. About 90% of it is drivable because it was public roads. So these early circuits were very interesting, but also very dangerous. But that kind of goes for circuits just about everywhere, to be honest.
Yeah, I'd just like to point out, Rennes, in 1951, it hosted the longest ever Formula One race in terms of distance. They did, I think it was 77 laps around a 5-point-something mile circuit, and it totaled up to 601 kilometers, which is literally double the length of the modern F1 race. But there were a couple of other little anomalies. I think Luigi Fagioli, I think in that race, Luigi Fagioli handed his car over to Fangio and became the oldest driver in F1 to win a race, the only F1 driver born in the 19th century to win a race. And he retired, and that was his only win. And he also became the only driver to ever have a Formula One race win without leading a lap in his entire career because he handed his car over to Fangio before that happened. Yeah, Fagioli is a bit of an anomaly in terms of F1. Loads of F1 records I could go on.
I think also the only race winner over the age of 50, as well as being the oldest ever.
Yeah, he may be. He might be. I'm trying to think of. I think.
There weren't many that were older because you mentioned Philippe Tonsilin before. He's the first ever F1 driver to be born. He was born, I think, December 1896.
Okay.
One of 3 or 4 drivers born in the 19th century.
Yeah. It was a weird time for Formula One and for racing. Obviously, we were talking about Rouen. That obviously had the famous hairpin that was kind of cobbled. Like, you'd never see cobbled streets on a modern F1 circuit because it'd just shake the cars to death. But yeah, there were 2 very good circuits for the time, because obviously Home was just classic 1930s, 1950s racing. It's just straights and hairpins. I mean, it's all about slipstreaming and it's all about who's got the best engine and whatever. And Rouen was a bit more technical, obviously, had fast sweepers, a hairpin, and some medium speed corners, and a couple more hairpins. But yeah, for the time, they weren't necessarily bad circuits, but they were basic, you could say, for modern day standards.
Well, the reason we're talking so much about the circuits here, Rouen and Reims, thanks for the two alternate pronunciations there as always, but for those two circuits, they they were the only thing France really had going in terms of relationship with Formula One between for a decade, I would say, because between 1958 and 1971, there were no French race winners, and between 1956 and 1967, there were no French teams. So all the drivers were kind of hit and miss, mostly one-offs, no one who was really notable. But then in 1967, Matra, who was enjoying success in the other categories and junior categories, decides to join Formula One in 1967. And I think the first year they officially competed was 1968, and their impact was huge, not just for France, but just for the sport, because in the second year of competing, they get a world champion.
Yeah, I mean, Jackie Stewart, I think, is who you're alluding to. The only man to win a championship because it was a Matra car, but it was entered by Ken Tyrrell. He's the only driver to ever win in a privateer team, to win a championship in a privateer team, because it was a Matra car completely prepared by Matra, but then ran by Ken Tyrrell and his squadron. So he was the only privateer.
Indeed, it was called the Matra International team because the Matra Works team did not have Jackie Stewart. And
Yeah.
I think as from 1970, they stopped entering. No, for 1969, they didn't even enter to focus on Ken Tyrrell's efforts.
Yes. So yeah, they have obviously. I think Stewart had a couple of French teammates. They had Johnny Servo-Gavin. I don't. Sever was a bit too early, but they had guys like Beltoise was kicking about before because he became kind of a Grand Prix kind of not veteran, but a kind of a guy who was always in and about the midfield. That's kind of where France started to assert their kind of not dominant, kind of a presence, because you had major sponsors in the form of Elf, like stuff like that, who basically would later go on to back the likes of Ligier and Prost, but we'll go on to those later. They also had the introduction of another or two circuits in that time period. Peter, do you want to take us through those?
Yeah, so there was Charade was another one, which some people may know as Clermont-Ferrand. This is a very interesting circuit because it's built on the side of a extinct, heavily eroded volcano. So this was nothing like the previous circuits. Very tight, very twisty, huge elevation change, very technical, and this also made it extremely dangerous.
Yes.
This one wasn't used as much, though. I mean, it was only used on 4 occasions, so it wasn't as popular as the previous two. But then after that, they brought in Dijon-Prenois. So this again, another very fast open circuit, but very short too. So that one was they made efforts to lengthen it. Again, a lot of these circuits were fairly kind of old-fashioned. But then there was the Paul Ricard circuit, which people will know because it's still being used to this day and was until very recently being used in Formula One. That was built basically.
Do not skip when F1 went to Le Mans, because that one is the one where people might be interested. 1967.
Yeah, there was a one-off appearance at Le Mans. I mean, slightly misleading. It wasn't at the full. They used the what's called the Bugatti circuit, which is these days is used by motorbikes. But what it does is it shares the pit straight and the paddock with the full Circuit de la Sarthe used for the 24 Hours of Le Mans. They used it once, but it was very short, very twisty, and just not very popular because I guess a lot of people would have been looking at that as thinking, why aren't we just using the full Le Mans circuit? But they went there once and it didn't really kick off.
A couple of things to note. First of all, they did also use turn 1 and 2 from the regular Le Mans circuit, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
Or at least it does nowadays. I'm not sure if they don't think they had the chicane back in the day, the modern term 1-2 chicane. But yeah, there were a couple of things to know. Obviously, I've driven the Charade circuit in sim racing, and I will just say it's one of the best circuits I've driven. Because it is a mini Nürburgring. I think there's a like a little statistic that despite it being like 6 or 8 kilometers long, the longest straight it has is 600 meters. It's just corner after corner after corner, and it's fantastic. The modern incarnation is obviously kind of a shortened down version, but still has some of the it has a pit straight. It has, I think, most of the last sector, but it doesn't have any of the mountain parts because those are real life roads. It was a last road circuit because there's a difference between a street circuit and a road circuit. A street circuit is one that's got all barriers put up that you see today. But a road circuit is where they just didn't change it from its regular real life counterpart on a regular day. And when it hosted its last race in 1972, it was the last ever road circuit that didn't have any safety precautions basically put on. They obviously had to change that because of Helmut Marko getting blinded by Ronnie Peterson's march, kicking up stones and stuff like that. Yeah, France's those kind of circuits. Reims, Rouen, and Charade. I mean, also Le Mans, but less so. They're all iconic circuits. They had a good presence on that front. It's just the drivers, and I mean, in that era of the teams, obviously we had Matra, who even technically didn't win that 69 title on their. I mean, not in terms of overall. It was a French-built car, but it wasn't a French team technically. So it wasn't until the 70s where drivers and teams started to come into the fray.
Exactly, because Matra, they were the only French team to win it, but that was only on paper, as you said. And it was a bit of a meme in France because you need to remember they won the championship in 1969, but then they didn't win. A French team didn't win the constructors championship until Renault in 2005 and 2006. So for more than 50 years of being in the sport, the only time they had won the championship was through a British team taking over their services. So that really wasn't great for France at the time. But when Tyrrell took over from Matra, one thing they did do was give just give a lot of attention to François Sévère, who ended up having a huge impact on the sport, partly through his skill and just his looks and the charisma he had on the grid, because everyone talks about him as the most handsome and charismatic guy they had ever seen, to the impact he had on Jackie Stewart, and therefore the impact that had on safety in Formula One.
Yeah, so he was basically treated as something like Jackie Stewart's protege in many ways. And the intention had been that when Stewart was going to retire, that Sévère would carry on effectively as team leader at Tyrrell. In his time, he got one victory, which came in 1971 at the final race in Watkins Glen. In 1973, when Stewart got his third title, Sévère finished second 6 times. So quite very, very consistent. But then it was at the final round when he was killed at Watkins Glen, actually, where he'd won his only race in an extremely violent manner during qualifying, which caused Stewart, who had already made the decision to retire, to then just not do the race since he already had the championship and he didn't want to go on any further. And this obviously then changed Tyrrell's plans quite a lot with him now dead. But Stewart himself had already been a major pushing for more improved safety, particularly track safety in terms of better barriers and protection and everything else, and the enforcement of full face helmets and seat belts and fire extinguishers. But this accelerated things even further and meant that he never sat in any kind of race car ever again.
Yeah, I mean, luckily for France, obviously, Sévère's death was detrimental to their whether the fortunes of Tyrrell would have gone downhill like they did without him, we don't know. But it wasn't necessarily that they quickly replaced him. but there were several drivers that came through in the couple of years following Sever's death that actually were pretty decent and really quite good. Obviously, you had Patrick Depailler, who came through. I think he made his debut in 1974, and quickly went to Tyrrell actually in the second seat to Jody Scheckter, and was a very, very decent driver. Quite underrated in many people's eyes. There was also the two Jean-Pierre Jarier and Jean-Pierre Jabouille. Jabouille oversaw the up and coming of a Renault team, and we can talk about that in a bit. But like Jarier is also an underrated driver because he got 3 pole positions in his career, and yet he never drove a car that really deserved that. He drove a Shadow, and he got I think he got 2 of his poles with Shadow, and the other one with I can't remember what the team was now. It might have been Ligier or it might have been Renault, but Jarier was a very underrated driver as well. You had the likes of Depailler, Jarier, Jabouille. I can't think of any other Grand Prix winners from the mid to late 70s. Maybe Jacques Lafitte, but he was had a lot more longevity than any of those guys we just mentioned.
And that's where it's important to talk about that relationship that Matra had with Tyrrell, because Matra being so close to Tyrrell is why Ken Tyrrell was always keen to have a second French driver, or I'm not sure if Matra was pushing for it, but that's why during the entirety of the 70s, you can't say that it was solely through pseudo-nepotism, but because, as you said, Depailler was really good, Didier Pironi was very good, but for the entirety of the 70s, Tyrrell had a French driver in their team, so that really gave a pathway for those French drivers, and obviously soon after, some major teams joined, which would also help that, but that Tyrrell-Matra partnership was crucial for France at that time.
Can I just say, I don't really think it was Tyrrell and Matra because I think Tyrrell were using Ford engines and stuff at that point. I think it was the Elf sponsorship they had. They had a major sponsorship deal with Elf that basically meant that they were
of course,
that way.
Yeah, exactly. So initially it was the partnership, but then obviously, Matra stepped out in like 71, 72 in terms of any help they would give. So yeah, the Elf, I'm sure the Elf sponsorship had a big impact, especially with the transition to the big teams that soon came, and that's where a big chapter of our story just starts here, because Renault and Ligier in 1976 and 1977 entered the sport. So that's when it really takes over. That's when France becomes, at some point, a third of the grid seemed to be French. It was insane, and that's where I'll give the floor to Peter with his big knowledge on Renault's entry in Formula One and what they did with the turbo engines.
So yeah, Renault stands out obviously because in 1977 they entered Formula One and they built the first ever turbocharged engine for Formula One. There had been a period in the past where those had been banned, but at the beginning of Formula One, teams like Alfa Romeo had supercharged engines, but nobody had ever attempted to build a turbocharger. So they were the first to do it. But initially they weren't really selling it to other teams to want to try this, because even though it was very powerful, I mean, in 77, they had the most powerful engine. It was just shy of 700 horsepower, roughly. It was very, very unreliable, and the car became known as the Yellow Teapot because it kept going up in a cloud of white smoke. And they also had issues with turbo lag in low-speed corners. What compounded this was that the car itself, the chassis, was very basic because they were mostly interested in developing the engine and showing that off. So they continued to develop this. The issue they had at first was that they did this just before the arrival of ground effect, and so which Lotus had pioneered, and so because that was proving so much more effective with their cars, every other team was initially copying ground effect and kind of ignoring turbo engines. So they continued developing the turbo power. They did find that eventually people started noticing the advantages they had at circuits at high altitude, particularly Kyalami in South Africa, because the thinner air didn't affect the turbos nearly as much as the naturally aspirated engines. The big shift came in '79 because until this point, Jean-Pierre Jabouille had been, for a time, he was their only driver. And he was effectively running the team because he was a mechanic, like a lot of drivers back in that day still were, and he had an engineering degree, so he was very heavily involved in development of the engine. And then he was joined by another rather young driver called René Arnoux. But at Dijon-Prenois 1979, Jabouille took the win, and he became the first French winner of the French Grand Prix in 40 years, or 30 years at that point, and the first one since Formula One's creation in 1950. People got a bit distracted though,
And
because behind...
interestingly, on Jabouille, he had 3 points finishes in Formula One. 2 of those were wins. It's utterly absurd. That's impossible to imagine now. But yeah, across at nearly 50 races entered, 49 starts, 2 wins, 3 points finishes.
Yeah, I mean, that demonstrates just how desperately unreliable this car was. I mean, Formula One cars have always been unreliable, but the turbos just accelerated that even more. But yeah, behind him, the battle for second was very interesting because it was his teammate Arnoux and then Gilles Villeneuve in the Ferrari were banging wheels and pushing each other off track and doing all of this and everything that would get you, get your racing license taken away and fired into the sun if you tried it in 2024. And that's kind of gone down. Yeah, 2025 even. It's, only a few days in. And so and it's kind of gone down as the stuff of legend, that battle, because again, Dijon-Prenois, relatively high altitude but also massive long straights, so perfectly suited for turbo power. And so that was it took a couple of years, but everyone else started adopting turbos and Renault really kind of started that revolution.
Another team that we haven't talked about them as much is Ligier. In the same year that that Renault Renault came to power and started winning races, I'm pretty sure they were like second or third in the constructors championship with Lafitte and Lafitte and Pironi, I think it was. They were starting to come to fruition because obviously they'd had a couple of big moments before that. Like I think in '76 they had the because the Renault was called the Yellow Teapot, but the Ligier looked like a teapot, and I think it was 1976 because of the stupid or massive airbox they had over the driver's head. And
75 because they banned those in '76.
Yeah,
because they were just too big.
But yeah, they had Ligier and Renault oversaw the big influx of French drivers, of the guys that we know today as the kind of good drivers from this kind of goal. I would say the late '70s, early '80s was the golden era of French drivers, because you had, as we've briefly talked about Arnoux, we've talked about Jabouille, we've talked about Jarier, we've talked about Pironi and Lafitte. These guys were undoubtedly. Obviously, Prost is the best driver from France in F1's history. There's no doubt about that. But the guys from second down to seventh or eighth in terms of France's best drivers, it's these guys. They are all fantastically able in their own right. If we're looking at 1979, obviously, we've got Jabouille and Pironi maybe, and Lafitte are the standout ones. But when you get to 1980, when Pironi moves to Ferrari, he becomes the best French driver. Lafitte he was an outside shot to win the 1981 title in Caesar's Palace. He could have won that title.
1979. There's an interesting fact on 1979 where Lafitte wins the first 2 races, dominates pole position, fastest lap in the Ligier Ford, and then just before South Africa, the 3rd race, the mechanic who had the setup written on a piece of paper loses that piece of paper, and they spend 2 or 3 more races trying to find the setup working again. In the 5th and 6th races, Lafitte gets pole position again, doesn't win because of unreliability, and by that point, second half of the season, Ferrari is faster, and it's then harder to deal with. But yeah, Lafitte in 1979 was seen at the start of the year as the certain champion, and it all fell apart because of a mechanic losing the setup, and that again makes you realize how at the time the smallest things could make everything change. A mechanic losing a setup on a piece of paper, a tissue that had some notes squiggled on it, that could lead to dire consequences for the results.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's just Laffy was a very capable driver. I think he has the second most wins for any French driver in F1 history. I think he's got 6. Because obviously Prost is well ahead on 51. But Laffy has 6. He might be joint with someone else, but I don't think he is. I think there's someone who has 5. I can't remember who it is. But yeah, Pironi then comes along in 1981 and particularly in 1982. I will say this: Keke Rosberg had a fantastic 1982 season, but Pironi deserved that title more. He did. He obviously had that crash in Hockenheim that ended his career with 2 or 3 races remaining, and he yet only finished 5 points off the championship. He would have easily got those in the last 5 races or the last however many races it was, and got that 1982 championship. And then you've got 1983, where Prost could have won the title. Arnoux could have arguably won the title because that Ferrari won the Constructors' Championship. Patrick Tambay comes along. He's also a Ferrari driver. There's loads of guys that come around. Prost had worse reliability in his Renault than the eventual champion Piquet did in his Brabham. But overall, yeah, that was arguably the best season in terms of overall performance of French drivers and French teams because it was maybe not teams, but yeah, we had Prost, Arnoux, Tambay all fighting at the front. I think Jarre had just retired, Jabouille had just retired. So this kind of new wave of new talents coming in, and Arnoux by this point, because he'd driven for Renault from 79 until 82, he had 21 or 22 pole positions in his career. Considering he only had like 5 or 6 race wins, that's a big number, and that just proves how fast those
I
Renaults
think
were
the
in
exact
that era.
stat on our new is he had 18 pole positions and he only converted 2, which people kept talking about because Leclerc also had at some point he was on 4 wins from 20 pole positions, and the only guy who was outshining him was René Arnoux from that unreliable period. And yeah, in 1983, second, third, and fourth in the standings were all French when Nelson Piquet won. And you need to realize at that point there was still no French F1 champion. Prost, just to not skip too much over what he did, because obviously he will have his own episode dedicated to him because of his greatness. But Prost, as a junior driver, I urge anyone to go look at it. All you see is first. I think there's 1 second in his very first season in single seaters. He was absolutely decimating that already golden generation of French drivers in the junior categories. And that's why in 1980 he was given a contract for McLaren. And that again gets forgotten. McLaren gave a contract as a very reputable team at that point to a random French driver. That's how good he was. And obviously that 1980 McLaren wasn't good enough, moves to Renault, and it just seemed to not come together for him at all because the unreliability just kept hampering any chances he had. Everyone knew how fast he was, but it just didn't seem to happen. And 1983 was yet another year where he finishes 2 points behind Piquet. At that point, he must be really tired because obviously 1984 he finishes half a point behind Lauda, and it was getting really desperate for French fans and French sponsors. Why were there so many good French drivers, but there were simply none who was stepping up to become a great F1 driver?
It seems that, I mean, around this period, reliability was the name of the game because it was an era of unprecedented experimentation and development because we had both ground effect and turbo power being experimented and tested at the same time. Because we mentioned obviously the Renault were the pioneers of turbo power. Ligier themselves were not pioneers of ground effect, but they were very good at it because their cars, the 79 and 80 cars in particular, had massive amounts of downforce, but they had too much of it because this is before we had carbon fiber chassis, and so they tended to just kind of bend the suspension arms, and that created a lot of the reliability problems that, as we said before, cost Lafitte the title in '79. Whereas Ferrari that year didn't have the best ground effect, and it was ill-fitting to their flat 12 engine. But because the car was very reliable, that meant that Jody Scheckter and Gilles Villeneuve finished first and second in the championship. Another thing was that in 1980 we lost Patrick Depailler, who at the time was driving for Alfa Romeo in a testing crash at the Hockenheim. So that was a big blow. It just seemed it wasn't quite coming together, and because it was, there were a lot of very good drivers, but things just weren't working that well. And even if it took him a few years, Prost was able to break through that and finally get some genuine success for French drivers.
Yeah, Prost's Renault years especially had so much lost potential because, like, for example, in 1982 is the perfect example of this. Prost won the first 2 races of 1982. He then retired from all of the next 6 races, or either retired or didn't or wasn't classified in them, and yet he was still leading the championship after round 6 or round 7 because of how crazy that 1982 season was. If that Renault was just a tiny bit more reliable and he got to the end of like 1 or 2 more of those races, he could have won the title outright by winning like 4 races.
Yeah, it really it was remarkable really that you could get away with scoring relatively few points or finishing relatively few races, but still finishing quite high up in the standings because the same thing was happening to everybody else. And his relationship with Renault, it didn't really go well, even though he gave them several wins and he was very invested in developing the car, and they got better. But the issue was that by this point, early 80s, Ferrari were now doing their own turbo engines. Brabham had their BMW ones, and then 83 onwards, basically everybody has turbo power because ground effect is gone. And at that point, Renault just kind of drifts back into obscurity, and then they pull out at the end of 1985 as well. But by that point, he'd moved to McLaren, and that was when he really got into a stride.
Well, before we move to his move to McLaren, would you say that that period, let's say 1977 to 1983, was the period where a single nation has dominated the standings that much? Because when you look at it, lots of times during those years, in the top 8, you would find 5, 6 French drivers. There would only be Piquet hanging out there, Alan Jones, Scheckter. But when you think about it, that hasn't happened since. And even before that, even when the Scots were dominating the sport, obviously there was Jim Clark, Graham Hill, but there weren't 5 or 6 of them. And again, we talk about the Brits, how they have been very present in the sport. Lewis, Jensen, but there wasn't really a third or fourth at the time. So there was no moment where you would have 5, 6 drivers of the same nation in the top 10. Would you say that was the only time, and probably will be the only time that will ever happen?
You briefly mentioned them. Like the Britain from like 1962 until 1968 or 9. You had, I mean, obviously with the whole debate about Scotland and all that sort of stuff. But if we class them as British for the purpose of this, you had Jim Clark, Jackie Stewart, John Surtees, Graham Hill, Jackie Oliver, other race winners like, I mean, maybe not Peter Geffen because he was a bit later, but guys like that, Brian Redman. People like that. I'd say there was probably 6 or 7 British, the same way that France had. I mean, if you look at all the other nations, you could argue maybe Italy in the early 1950s, just because
Were they competing again, and were they competing under the UK flag or the Scottish flag at that point?
It was always UK.
It was always UK.
Always UK.
I don't think there's ever been a Scottish driver in F1 history.
Yeah, this ain't the Olympics or the World Cup where we split us all up.
Yeah.
That's the thing. I would assume so, but
Scottish.
Because the Scottish drivers who race in Formula One have so often been so nationalistic about Scotland, I thought maybe in the 60s they might have driven under the Scottish flag, but yeah, I mean, it was so famously Scottish, is what I'm saying.
I think Jim Clark was probably a bit too timid to be into that kind of not political, but kind of political centric kind of debate. And Jackie Stewart probably realised it's probably best for, like, because he was arguably the biggest name at one point, probably best to name himself British so that he can get more sponsorship or stuff like that. Yeah, like obviously we've got people like David Coulthard and stuff, but the only reason I think is the running joke of the guys who are really successful we class as British, and the guys who aren't successful, like David Coulthard, we class as Scottish, is the typical British joke we have.
Yeah, Iron Brew Tyrrell F1 team we could have had maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
the
thing
it
is
was an oddity it was definitely an oddity to have so many drivers from the same country doing so well, because since then, since the French at that point, we haven't had this, and I don't think it will ever happen.
I
Really.
mean, Germany had a bit of a thing from the mid 2000s to the early 2010 to the early to mid 2010s.
The
Rosberg,
Schumacher effect.
yeah, Rosberg,
Yeah.
Heidfeld, Vettel, people like that.
Glocks, the Till, yeah.
Yeah.
I think the thing is, it was hard. It was harder for that to happen because by this point, there was more of a mix of nationalities, and the number of people entering had just gone up. Because this is a bit of a segue back, because in the 50s, it was mostly, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the podcast, the key four nations of Britain, France, Germany, and Italy.
And then
Because
maybe
again,
America for the Indy 500.
yeah, America. The thing is, America was still. America's motor racing scene has always been very kind of isolated from Europe, and because they began racing 1895 was the first race in America, so just after France. But again, those key four nations are quite important with this, because another thing about this is liveries, because the Renault car is yellow, but all other French teams have always had that bleu royal, the royal blue color, and we see that even today with Alpine. But because in the pre-war era, that they decided to basically color code the nationalities. So France was blue, Italy was red, Britain was green, and then Germany, it was originally white, but then they stopped painting the cars to save weight, and so then we got the silver arrows out of that.
Trying to think of the other. I'm trying to think if there's any of that. Belgium was yellow. I'm trying to think of any other nations. Can't really think.
Netherlands has never been much on the racing up until a certain someone recently. But you'd think they'd just go all orange if they would. But yeah, those are really the key four. I mean, yeah, that was again why I was surprising that France struggled in the 1950s. I mean, Germany was playing catch up after Mustache Man manifesting his destiny all over Europe for 6 years. That kind of knocked them back a bit in the engineering department, but and being everyone's friends. Yeah, so it's hard. You wonder what it is that you suddenly get this explosion of drivers born like in the 40s and 50s, growing up in the 60s. They suddenly all wanted to do Formula One, and it's
And what was surprising to me is it wasn't shit drivers. They were all decent, if not good, if not very good drivers. You didn't have a lot of French backmarkers who were joining in that at that stage. They were drivers who were all upper midfield or better, and that's what I felt was quite weird. And before we move on to the Prost championship winning years, we need to talk about what is I think quite underrated in the Anglophone world as a title fight and as a rivalry, because Lauda versus Hunt gets pushed so much when Hunt was only in there because Lauda nearly died. And I feel like people really forget about Pironi. I think that's a good name for the rivalry. Pironi versus Arnoux, and how those two hated each other, and how Prost and Pironi also had issues. Those French drivers, some loved each other and some really hated each other.
I mean, I didn't know much about this personally, because I suppose it's interesting because they come from separate teams, so it's not necessarily inter-team rivalry. Because I know that famously, well, Villeneuve and Pironi were not exactly on good terms after their conduct in Imola. But yeah, there was often tension. I mean, we see even today, like everyone assumes that all the drivers are best friends, but it's pretty clear that Verstappen and Russell don't get on, for example. So yeah, no doubt that would have been the case back then. I mean, Pironi seemed to be good at creating enemies.
Yeah, he kind of did, to be honest. We haven't talked about the tracks for a while. I mean, we briefly touched on Paul Ricard. That was when that track had started to just come onto the schedule towards the mid to late 70s. Peter, do you want to take us through the years of that? There weren't really any major races from memory apart from that one you mentioned at Dijon in 79.
Yeah, I mean, this one, well, after his victory, Prost himself won at Paul Ricard twice in 81 and 83. So two more French victories at home. Paul Ricard, very modern circuit compared to these rather aged ones. I mean, today it's known for being state of the art in terms of safety standards.
And that runoff.
Yeah, but at the time, it was really good, particularly for turbo cars, because the Mistral Straight did not have that really annoying chicane in the middle. So you had this uninterrupted, basically 1.5 mile long straight. And so the turbo cars at their peak were getting up to about 230 miles an hour. going down there. But then they eventually shortened it because they thought, well, no, this is too dangerous. We can't keep going there. And then after another blow was dealt when Elio De Angelis was killed in a testing crash there in 1986. And so they eventually stopped racing there. But it was, by all accounts, it was a good circuit. And the races were generally more interesting than the modern one, which has not been very good and has a tendency to give people seizures as well.
The one notable one was 1982, where it was a French 1, 2, 3, 4. Kind of insane to think about nowadays. Ocon, Gasly, Hadjar. Yeah, not too sure how that would go. But yeah,
Martin.
the French did a 1, 2, 3, 4 in 1982, and that's when Arnoux versus Prost at Renault really flared up, because Arnoux had told the team and Prost that he will give the lead back to Prost if Prost, I think the initial thing was that Prost would not bother Arnoux for the first part of the race, but then Arnoux would give it to Prost. And then obviously that win could have had huge consequences on the title race, as Nedzo said, 1982 was a mess. And Arnoux never gave it back to Prost. And as from then, word is they never spoke to each other again, because Arnoux realized, okay, I could be winning here with Renault in France. And he didn't give up the lead. And yeah, that was how petty they used to be. And when you think about it, that could have been one of the reasons why they never got to the title. Because if you think about those drivers working together, at least you could have had the Renault winning the constructors. They had incredible drivers at that time, but they just ended up losing their drivers to Ferrari, McLaren, and Renault completely went defunct. So yeah, the French really lost an opportunity not only to win a constructors title, but also to get a world champion. A lot of people say that 1982, as Nedzo said, Pironi should have won it and could have won it if simply those drivers had worked better with each other. And yeah, the other track at that point, Peter, would you say that Dijon is a track that will be missed or that is missed?
Not particularly. I mean, it's got that one famous moment in '79, but otherwise, it's a very short circuit. It's very basic. It's not nearly as interesting as the other ones.
Yeah, I'd agree. There's not really going for it.
But yeah, I think once ground effect was banned in '83, this was the turning point where Prost started basically carrying the entire nation by himself. Because they'd, as I mentioned, Depailler had not lost in '80. Pironi suffered career-ending injuries in '82 and then died in a speedboat accident in '86 or '87. Patrick Tambay is someone we haven't mentioned because he started out doing McLaren, and then he did a bit of Can-Am and won that title. He was at Ferrari alongside Arnoux, and '83 they did actually manage to take the constructors title, even though they were third and fourth in the drivers' standings. They had, yeah, he did that. He did a stint with Renault as well, but this was when they were in rapid decline and they folded at the end of '85. So team, yeah, for them it wasn't working so well. I mean, Jarier was getting pretty old. Lafitte was approaching 40 by this point as well. Arnoux's career never really recovered after Ferrari, but Prost, yeah, really got into a stride.
Yeah,
And Prost at that point. Sorry, just Prost at that point, just to confirm, he had fully taken over from that entire generation, and he was the only one really competing. Yes, Nedzo.
Yeah, so I think Tambay retired at the end of '86. He did his last season with Haas Lola with Alan Jones. Arnoux obviously competed until 1989, but he was driving for Ligier and wasn't that competitive. If you look at the drivers that France were producing from '85 until about 1990, or even later, they were just CAC, Philippe Streif, Francois Eno, however you pronounce that name. Pascal
You
Fabre.
got it bang on. It is Eno, which is extremely impressive as a Brit to get that right.
Pascal Fabre. He won didn't he win the Jim Clark Trophy one year for naturally aspirated teams?
No, that was Jonathan Palmer in '87.
Okay. But yeah, but in general, like you look at the guys from around that era, the kind of Pierre-Henri Lafanel, people like that, they were just nowhere, to be honest.
Jean-Louis Schlesser, OCD's worst nightmare.
Yeah,
as
JLS.
well.
JLS, great UK pop band.
Yeah, I mean,
Really
the thing
talented
about
though.
Strife is that he wasn't bad. It's just that he got paralyzed. Before that, he was kind of all right, but yeah, just he had the
And Schlesser
accident.
became a bit of a legend in Dakar as well. He won it twice with his own team. A lot of those drivers, actually, that
Very good
those
in
French
endurance
drivers,
racing as well, Schlesser.
exactly. So a lot of those French drivers, actually, from that period, they were good drivers, racers, not just didn't really make it into Formula One, but a lot of them did really well at Le Mans, sports cars. We need to also mention at that point, sports cars was massive,
Mm.
and a lot of drivers would go for Peugeot's sports car project because at that point it was when Formula One was starting to get threatened by sports cars, and some of those French drivers could have seen a bigger incentive to win at Le Mans than winning the San Marino Grand Prix, for example.
Yeah. One thing I was just going to say something and I've completely forgotten what it was. There was one. John Louis Schlesser. The one thing he did in F1 was break McLaren's 100% record streak in 1988 because he crashed into Senna at Monza. But yeah,
Mm.
this kind of the kind of 85 to 1990, maybe even a little bit further, we could go on for the likes of Eric Bernard, Eric Coma, Jean-Pierre, Jean-Christophe Bouillon and Jean-Marc Gounon. There we go, got those two right. Those they're kind of on the same level as kind of what they had in the early to mid 70s, the likes of Henri Pescarolo. I'm just flexing the accent now, I think, at this point. But those
I mean,
kind of guys.
Pescarolo, he's an example from sports car racing that French drivers across since the 1950s they'd been always excellent in sports cars, and he founded his own team
Yeah.
they were racing in Le Mans. I know this from playing Gran Turismo like 20 years ago, but yeah, people like that, and then
They were the
because I mean,
PlayStation team. If you remember the livery with a big
yes,
PlayStation 2 on it, that's the
yeah,
Pescarolo
and
team.
again we said like Guy Ligier founded his own team. There was also Gerard Lerousse, or he had his own team. I mean, not very good one in the early 90s in Formula One. They were all that across motorsports in general, just very good. But Formula One, it was very touch and go at this point, and it seems like particularly from when Prost retired, it became just Le Maire de Mid, so to speak. After that,
Genuinely, because when Arnoux and Lafitte retired, they were both over 40. And I actually have a stat here. They were. And who do you think are the only lineups since to have had two drivers who eventually competed until they were older than 40? So Arnoux and Lafitte were older than 40 when they competed together, but there is a lineup who, when they were together, they were not 40, but both of them eventually competed until they were 40. Can you guess?
There's one I can think that's close, but I don't think gets it. Hill and Mansell in 94. Because
No.
Mansell went on to become.
well, it's a bit more obvious than that. It's Alonso and Kimi. I mean,
No, no,
as
no. Well,
as teammates,
yes.
they were mid 30s, but they both eventually raced until in their 40s.
Yeah. So, well, the actual question was the first since, but that's the second one. The first was a bit harder. It was Kimi and De La Rosa, because they raced together
Oh,
in
yeah.
2006, and De La Rosa went on to race when he was 41 and Kimi 43. So yeah,
Smart ass.
exactly. So all French drivers, those French drivers basically raced until the end of their time span, and no one really took over. But the thing is, even though there were not a lot of French drivers after 1985, Prost was busy winning four. So let's get into let's get into the king of French motorsport, Alain Prost. How did he become so good at McLaren? Was it speed or brains or whatever people can find?
In my opinion, it was just ruthless consistency. Like, he won his titles in 85, 86, 89, and 93. But you could make a case. This is what I've always been saying. This is why I put him way above Senna in my rankings of all time Formula One drivers, because you could argue for like 9, 8, 9, 10 seasons that he was the best driver. 1981, 1982, 1983, 84, you could even argue. His 2 championship years, that makes 6 or 7. It all adds up. And he got more points than Senna in 88, got more points than Senna in 89. This is what Senna fans don't like to point out. And I don't know whether the McLaren or the Ferrari was quicker in 1990, but the fact he took it to the championship finale and could have won that one, arguably the best driver in 1990. 1991 the car was just awful, so we can't really know. But in 1993, I mean, you could argue Senna was better because Prost wasn't used to those cars. But Prost, you could argue, was the best driver for 10 or so years. Even the likes of Schumacher, the likes of Hamilton's not in the GOAT conversation, but the likes of Schumacher, the likes of Senna, the likes of Fangio, Clark. I mean, their careers didn't last long enough, but they can't say that they were the best driver for 10 seasons straight or 10 seasons in their career.
Yeah, I mean, he's called the Professor for a reason. I mean, just cripplingly underrated driver, incredibly well-rounded.
You just to say hello to all the comments who will say hi to Nedzo for somehow putting that Lewis Hamilton is nowhere near the good conversation. Shout out to you guys. To you, Peter.
I mean, I'll put in a markedly less spicy take that Prost is clearly the better driver out of him and Senna. I mean, yeah, Prost. He was called the Professor because he was known for just having incredible technical understanding. He would set his cars up for race pace, which is why his qualifying record is not brilliant. Whereas Senna had more of a, dare I say, caveman approach to driving of just fast car go burr, just drive hard and fast. And partly because of this, because he was an exceptional qualifier, Prost realised, okay, I'm not going to beat him on qualifying, so I'm just going to set the car up for the races. Also, Prost was not the world's greatest wet weather driver. That's somewhere where Senna was exceptional. But elsewhere, he really knew what he was doing, and he played the game well, and he could think ahead, and he understood strategies and everything. But it's just that in the media, and particularly because of the movie documentary and then the Netflix series that came out recently, he's always portrayed as the heel in their title battle, and which I don't think is entirely fair.
I don't know why Senna didn't even at least try and take some of Prost's approach of setting up the cars for the races, because especially when they were at McLaren, that McLaren was, if not the fastest car by a country mile like it was in 88, it was at least on par with the likes of Williams and Ferrari. So starting like P6 doesn't really matter if you've got a car that can just bullet through the rest of the field in the race and just have better tyre wear, better fuel consumption and stuff like that. So I don't see why Senna was so, because I saw an Instagram post the other week, and it was like, this is Senna's qualifying gaps to his teammates at Monaco every single year, and people were like going,
I saw that.
Wow. Yeah, people are going like
that literally this morning, and it was like Prost was 1.1 seconds. Somehow Johnny Cecotto was 0.8 seconds, so that means Cecotto
Gerhard Berger was
closer
faster as well. So Johnny Cecotto and Gerhard Berger are better drivers than Alain Prost. Clearly not.
Well, it's like that timeline that says that Daniel Kvyat is the greatest driver ever. If you just follow the team lane.
Because Nakajima was 5 seconds slower than Senna on one quali session, which I think was partly due to mechanical issues, because you wouldn't just be 5 seconds slower even if you were bad. With the nature of social media, there were two comments saying, yeah, Satoru Nakajima is one of, if not the worst F1 driver ever. And I'm like, no way is Satoru Nakajima.
He is worshipped in Japan as well. Like
Don't get me wrong, he was not great. Like he was in a Lotus that Senna was getting wins and poles positions in. And I don't think he even got a podium. But he wasn't horrendous. He wasn't like he was mediocre. He was a mediocre a mediocre 90s Japanese driver before the 90s came along.
And for the time he was the closest it would get to a Japanese driver getting into F1, not through engine links, because he was genuinely really good in Japan. So yeah,
I mean, obviously it was through a deal with Honda, but still he was the first full-time Japanese driver. I mean, he's held in a similar regard in Japan to the way that Jackie Stewart is in the UK, or even Prost in France, as the sort of patriarch of the motorsport world in that sense. But Prost as well. The other thing with Senna is that he had this mentality that, oh, well, I don't need to just beat him, I need to destroy him. And that's where you get races like Monaco in 88, where he was miles ahead and was trying to lap him and then goes and crashes out or whatever. It was that kind of thing that Prost didn't do that. And he was more conservative, famously very, very smooth driving style. So he wasn't too bad on wearing the cars out, the tires. There were a couple of races. I think it was Imola one year. He won it by basically like shuffling the car over the finish line when it ran out of fuel. It's stuff like that. He had areas that where he wasn't so strong. Yeah, qualifying in wet races, but everywhere else he was just excellent.
Yeah.
And there is I think it's a recent development because I didn't see that online before, but the development that Senna would have a better car for a lot of the years, or through like Honda trying to prioritize Senna, those things really need to get taken into account, because when you're comparing drivers head to head, you think that only the stats matter. There's also who the team wants to win, who the team principal might want to win, who the engine supplier, especially with Honda being extremely close to Senna, might want to win.
There was also, this is perfect. Honda, before we went to McLaren, were at times prioritizing Nelson Piquet at Williams over Nigel Mansell. That does happen. I mean, because people like, for example, Senna fans will always talk about how Prost played the political game and he was cunning, and Suzuka 1989, he cheated, and he did cheat by turning in too early. However, Senna was just as bad. Senna turned into Prost intentionally didn't turn into him. He full throttled into a barrier in Suzuka in 1990, and people say, "Oh, well, it's revenge." Like, no, it's not NASCAR. Fuck off.
It was much more egregious than what Prost did, even though, because some people were still debating the 89 one, but then more recently there was footage that came out showing it head on. You can clearly see it's Prost turning into Senna, and it's like, okay, that's on Prost. But yeah, you can see how there'd been tension for Prost, because at this point he'd already come into McLaren and won two titles with them. He was the first driver since the 1950s to win back-to-back titles. He dispatched Niki Lauda, who was basically the GOAT at this point as well. And then Senna comes in. Senna is younger. He's less experienced. He's bringing this Honda deal with him from Lotus to McLaren. So they're getting entirely new engines because of him. You can see how Prost would feel threatened and usurped in a team that he sort of established himself in. And you can see how Senna would think, well, Prost is the best, and I need to beat the best to be the best.
Can I just ask, what engines were McLaren using before they got Hondas? Because I know they used tags in '84. Were they still using those?
Yeah, they still had those, the tag engines,
Okay.
until '87. Yeah.
Okay.
Just to be sure, Tag was basically Porsche, right?
Yes.
Yeah, they just rebranded it. There's this weird obsession. I know this because I'm researching this for a video. This weird obsession with rebranding engines constantly
Super
when they're
Tech,
not.
Play Life, Mecha.
Asia Tech,
Asia Tech, European,
Acer.
Mecha Crow.
Mercedes.
Yeah.
I remember when I was 13 and I first discovered it. I was just on Wikipedia and I saw Prost Ace, and I was like, Ace, and I clicked on Ace hoping it wasn't the stupid laptop I was researching it on, and I see Ace, I know it was actually the same, and I'm like, what do you mean they made an engine? And obviously I was 13, so
Yeah.
I thought they were making the V10 or V12.
I would love it if it was literally, it was actually an electric car. It was a laptop that was running the car or something. That would be amazing. It's like, yeah, this is the precursor to Formula E.
Yeah.
Or something.
Starts
But yeah,
really
I suppose soon we may need to get to Prost the team as well.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, there is the thing. So we had that. I mean, he went to Ferrari again. Prost is only human. It didn't work out. He lost the title with them in a similar way to how it didn't really work out with our new Pironi and Tombe. After spending a year out, he gets his fourth title with Williams. I mean, that was remarkable because I mean the car was awesome, although he actually didn't like it because this was the one that was blinged up with traction control and active suspension and all of that, and he didn't enjoy that. Yeah, he didn't enjoy. He had a lot of that stuff just switched off because I prefer the more passive or the more passive cars, and I don't like this, and still took the title, and then finally called it quits. And from then on, it's just kind of oh dear in terms of drivers.
There are about 8,000 different rumors that he was going to come back with different teams. Like, I mean, he nearly drove for Ligier in '92. He nearly drove Ligier apparently again in '94, '95. Before he took over Prost, eventually there were about 8,000 rumors that he was going to come back with Ligier.
The French government which heavily backed Ligier as the only team from France at that point. They were begging for Prost to join Ligier because the prospect of the best Formula One driver in the world driving for a French team was so big, and it just never happened. So
He did
Yeah, looking
tests
at
for
the
them
news,
though, didn't he?
Secret
he did.
test.
There are
Was
some
Yeah,
tricks. So, but
yeah.
kind of transitioning out of Prost to, let's call it the 80s and 90s, the late 80s and 90s without Prost. Ligier were still going, as we said. Prost nearly joined them. One of the engines, I'm just looking at it, was called the Megatron. That's
that's
straight up,
BMW.
yeah, but
That's
interesting
BMW.
name. Yeah, exactly, but interesting name.
Megatron, yeah.
Um, but
But
yeah,
it's like the
they
car's a
because they
transformer. Right.
because they couldn't get Prost, they were stuck with some of the middest French drivers you would have ever met. So Eric Comas, Philippe Alliot, Olivier Grouillard, Franck Lagorce, Eric Bernard. Again, those are drivers who were successful in other categories, just they were painfully
Amateur.
mid.
Some of them are Le Mans winners, I think, as well. But
Yeah.
yeah, it just
I
it
mean, if
didn't.
you
I
ask,
mean, the thing,
I was
like,
going to say. Oh, I was going to say if you ask James Hunt, Philippe Alliot is the worst driver that ever existed.
he famously was it Arnoux. Arnoux was one of the ones he didn't like as well. Or there was
Oh
a
yeah,
thing
he said
about
the René Arnoux. The reason René Arnoux says the reason I'm going so slow these days is because I don't like these turbo cars. I'm so used to natural aspirated cars. And these turbo cars are very difficult to drive. And James Hunt just goes, "Well, I call that bullshit."
I mean, he started in turbo cars. I mean, it's funny. The thing is, I forget because he was running. I would say until 1989. Is that the thing is, his post Ferrari career is so forgettable that you forget that he was there for the entire 1980s, and yet was like a bit
So
of a fossil at 41 when he retired.
yeah, researching this video, I found out how a lot of people think that René Arnoux should have just retired after 1984, 1983, because it's one of those drivers whose legacy gets forgotten because their stats just kind of get diluted from being backmarkers for so many years. And I also found out that Arnoux is the driver who, through his performance, coined the mobile chicane term, because he was the one being the mobile chicane in Monaco.
Because he
which is
refused to give up for blue
branded.
because blue flags were optional at the time, weren't they?
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
But
And Arnoux, in his head, was still a Ferrari-worthy driver, so he was trying to race the front runners instead of letting them go. But I need to say, for Ligier, I need to plug our good friend the Mobile Chicane's video on Ligier, because that's an excellent video on everything that happened and how the French government were keeping the team alive for so long, even when they started to be kind of shit. And during that time, there was not just Ligier as a French team, there was also AGS, Venturi, Larousse, all backmarkers who just didn't do much. What does our resident backmarker expert have to say about AGS and Larousse?
Yeah, they just kind of struggled. I mean, AGS built some very, very touch and go cars around late 80s, early 90s, very pretty ones, but just not brilliant. I mean, this was an interesting phase because we mentioned about the late 70s, early 80s, a period of innovation and this explosion of French drivers. Late 80s, early 90s, there was just an explosion of incompetent teams that just shouldn't have been there. Because we had people like that, and we had Coloni and Eurobrune and Andrea Moda and Life and Pacific and Simtech
40.
and all of this. 40, yeah, they were the last of those teams, really.
Lola.
Lola, yeah, well, the very last remnant MasterCard Lola. But yeah, Larousse, there wasn't really much going on there. I mean, they're the one that had a year as
Venturi.
Venturi when we had the famous case of the mobster / serial killer that bought the team and then got shot himself in a standoff with the police. Funny little episode, that one. There was also the case of a driver. Well, this is an interesting one because Bertrand Gachot is trying to be like every country at once because he was born in Luxembourg, but then he raced as both French and Belgian. And he, of course, he drove for Venturi, but this is the story no one ever talks about because all they talk about is him going to prison and giving Michael Schumacher his big break. So that was kind of an interesting tidbit for that stuff. But Larousse itself, founded by Gerard Lewis, the other Didier Kamel was the other co-founder, and he went to prison for murdering his wife in the late 1980s. So that was fun. So
Great
there was a lot.
we have in Formula One, don't we?
Yeah, there was a lot of this stuff. I mean, we saw recently because we were talking about Brabham that all their succession of owners in the final few years went to prison for tax fraud and all of this stuff, and then Andrea Moda, connections to the mafia and burning down discotheques and restaurants and all of that stuff. And the other Jean-Claude Van Rossum, burning his Porsche in a town square in Belgium and calling. I think he didn't he call Bernie Ecclestone a Nazi or a terrorist or something like that as well.
I mean, if you said that about Mosley, it'd be correct.
Yeah, very, very, very. At least a Nazi in the bedroom, apparently. Yeah, very. It's a very entertaining period. I mean, Drive to Survive would have had a field day back then. Larousse themselves, they lasted until 1994. Ligier had a sort of mini renaissance in the early 90s because they had. I mean, in 1993 they got a few podiums. 1994 they had what for the time was an exceptionally reliable car. And one of the best results they had actually was Germany when Olivier Panis and Eric Bernard finished second and third and got the first French double podium in a very long time. And then eventually, of course, we see 1996 when Panis actually won in Monaco to add to the list of many mid one-time winning Frenchmen.
Yeah.
Something that I think if Ciaron was here and some other 90s enthusiasts were here, they would say that Panis was quite a huge talent. And it never came to fruition after his big accident. But yeah, in the latter half of the 90s, it's a big debate. I've noticed that some people claim that Panis could have been a front runner, and some say that no, he was just overrated. But he was the only real hope across the entirety of, I'd say, like a 10-year span between 1993 and 2003. Really, for France, he was the only guy who was kind of prospective driver.
Lacey?
Other than the other who was much older, that was in terms of prospects, but a guy we are kind of skipping here is Jean Alesi, who somehow we have glossed over him a bit like race wins glossed over him really. He only got one win, and I'd say every single person believes he should have had more.
No. He was too aggressive. He drove like an idiot sometimes. He had a good race at Phoenix in 1990 when he overtook Senna and led for a little bit. But people who say like, oh, he was, they see him in the same vein that they see Gilles Villeneuve. Oh, Villeneuve was a champion in the making. He had a chance in 1979 and didn't get it. Alesi went up against Gerhard Berger, a fantastic driver, but wasn't really championship caliber. If he'd have beat him in any of the years that they were teammates in a considerable way, he was a future champion. But he didn't. He didn't do any of that. I don't know why people say Villeneuve and Alesi and people like that were like champions when they were just super aggressive and had a couple of like iconic moments where the so-called amazing thing they did was just damaging the car more, like with Villeneuve and his puncture antic where he's snapping at the car when he's got three wheels or when he's got no front wing and he's having to look through a broken front wing. Alesi was the same.
Wouldn't you say Alesi did deserve more than one win at least? Because he had some wins stripped away in what I would actually describe as bad luck. Not Nico Hülkenberg bad luck where he actually just bins it at Baku. I'm saying bad luck where the car just stops functioning.
I mean,
yeah. Monaco 96 maybe.
Yeah, one win from 32 podiums is disgraceful, and his finishing rate I think is less than 50% as well. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous.
Part of the cars.
Yeah, I mean, he had a lot of that is the cars. I mean, because he happened to join Ferrari at one of their worst periods, though, when they were sticking their heads in the sand regarding their V12 engines. Like, oh no, there's nothing wrong with these; they're absolutely fine and whatnot. When they were blowing up constantly. Yeah, I mean, he again was immensely popular in the 90s. I mean, he was the most prolific driver in that I think he raced in all but one race in the 90s. He only missed two. He only missed 3 races in the 90s.
Well, some of those were in 94 when he had that injury, wasn't it? And then
he missed he missed 2 in 94, and then Japan 1990 failed to start. But otherwise, he started every race. So not bad going there. But yeah, it just for him it just didn't. He could have had maybe. I mean, he's the kind of person who, if he was around today, he probably would have had finished his career with about 10 wins, not with just the one.
I wouldn't go that far. I'd maybe say 5 wins. Someone on the same level as. Actually, I would say someone on the level of. I can't really think of anyone who has kind of like that kind of middling like 5 wins who isn't like at the start of their career. But
I mean,
I
if Bottas can win 10 races, I think Alesi can with
Bottas was
cars that
more-
work.
Bottas was more
Sergio
consistent.
Perez has 5 or 6 wins, I think.
Yeah, that seems about right. But I mean, they have different styles. Sergio's a lot smoother and had a very good career and very consistent and respectable career before 2021. There was no real today's comparison, but I think Alesi would have got 4 or 5 wins. I don't think he would have got 10 because he was too inconsistent for that. Like there was several times, like France 1999, I think he was running second, and then he spins off on his own in the pouring rain. Like there was some like
But you need
he
to
was like
realize also in '94, so when F1 had that breadth of that big issue in terms of talent and attention, Alesi was one of those with Schumacher who kept Formula One going really when Senna died.
I mean, you could argue that, but it was just Berger was just as good as him, if not much better. I'd put Alesi on the same. This is going to be a very hot take, but I'll put Alesi probably on a similar, maybe slightly lower level than Pastor Maldonado in terms of overall driving ability, because they both had
My
very
God.
similar traits.
I think for me, he's basically a less annoying version of Daniel Ricciardo.
Yeah, I'll go with that.
That's a good one. That's a much better one than Pastor Maldonado for Jean Alesi, I would say. There's
Maldonado
30
is
podiums,
underrated. I'll die on that hill.
I mean, if you
30,
wanted to look at
30
careers at a
plus
glance, you
podiums
could
in the 90s.
yeah. I mean, if you wanted to look at Pastor Maldonado, compare careers at a glance, you could say it's more like Jabouille in terms of results. But yeah. No, he was kind of. I mean, because he had a big personality and also, I mean, Ferrari drivers are always immensely popular, and he was sort of Italian, come from an Italian
He
family,
was
but
Villeneuve 2.0, and he had the 27 and stuff, so that just all kind of intermingled.
and the cars were very pretty and they sounded good, even if they were useless and didn't work as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I suppose at this point everyone was begging for Prost to come back, and he did come back in some form when he decided to buy Ligier in 1997. Yeah, I mean, this was a very interesting period. The Prost team, because they ran for 5 seasons. Their first season actually was very good because they were using the car that Ligier had built for 1997, which was just an improved version of their race-winning 96 car. And using that car, and it still had the Mugen Honda engines as well. Parnis was getting podiums and was like, he was being consistent enough to be like the most outside of title contenders ever, and then he went and broke his legs in Canada, and that just kind of killed all of that basically. And then after that, when they started designing their own cars, they weren't very good. They used Peugeot engines, who again, actually Peugeot as an engine supplier, they did a 1 year in 1994 with McLaren. McLaren were like, nah, mate, you're all right, and got rid of them after 1 year, went to Mercedes. Then they went to Jordan, and then Prost took Jordan's Peugeot deal, and Jordan took Mugen Honda. So and that didn't work, and yeah, it just kind of collapsed as a project, and Prost said it was like the biggest regret of his career.
I'm not sure if Nav will back me up on this, but essentially they tried so hard to make Prost this new French wave of amazing team. They had all the French sponsors, Elf, Gauloise. I mean, they had other ones like PlayStation and BIC, the pen making company. But they tried.
That's the funniest thing, by the way. The fact they had Bic on that car was insane because it's as if you guys had not even think like Stedler on a Formula One car.
They tried.
It was insane.
They tried so hard to make that the almighty French team with the Peugeot engines, which apparently at one point were really powerful. But Prost was saying that like Prost himself was saying they're shit, but Peugeot was saying they're not. You're just not using them right. And then they did that until 2000. Then Prost spent pretty much their entire 2001 budget on customer 1-year-old Ferrari engines that were shit. And then, I mean, Peter knows all. We can go to now about the whole French bit, and then we can go to Peter about Phoenix Finance.
Oh yeah, of course. So after Prost collapsed at the end of 2001, Tom Walkinshaw struck a deal with an old friend of his from back in the day to try and build a team they were going to call Phoenix Finance, and they took the assets. So they had the cars and the engines and tires and everything else that Prost had the previous year. They tried to enter this for 2002, but because the FIA said you hadn't actually bought the entry as well as the assets that it was an entirely new constructor, and therefore they had to pay the however big the entry fee was at the time. I think it was quite significant, like
Similar
100
to
million.
Andrea Moda in 1992, where they had a similar issue.
Yeah, I mean, they only had to pay 100 grand, whereas this was in the millions, the amount they had to pay. And they turned up in Malaysia. They were turned away at the gates, but they had a car, but it was a weird one that they'd sort of that they couldn't fit the engine in. They were using Brian Hart engines from Arrows from about 5 years earlier, but they didn't fit the Prost. So basically, they took the back half of the three-seater version of the one of the Arrows cars and stuck it on the front of the Prost and created
God.
this sort of Frankenstein's monster. I can't find any photos anywhere of this car, but I really want to. And this was all done at the Leafield Technical Centre, which at the time was the Arrows factory and then was run by Super Aguri and then Caterham. And they tried to enter, and that just didn't. They just weren't allowed to and gave up on. There was a very, very long court case a couple of months later, which they eventually lost, and they weren't allowed into Formula One. But it didn't work at all because Prost the final year they kept going for jobs because they took on Gaston Mazzacane, and then they realised he was useless and got rid of him after 4 races. Jean Lacey was in there. They had Thomas Enger, but then he was doing cocaine or something or weeds. They couldn't have him.
Yeah, he got busted cocaine in 2012, I think, but I'm not sure.
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, Lacey, he burned bridges as Sauber in '99, and then he joined them for 2 years, and then he scored them some points in 2001, but then he fell out and he left, and he did a seat swap with Heinz-Hald Frentzen at Jordan for a few races, and it just didn't. The whole project was
do a race for them.
Well, he did several. He was the mid-season replacement for Mazzacane, but then he had that massive crash in Belgium, and so then couldn't do the rest, and then they brought in Thomas Enger for 3 races.
Nav, do you want to do your bit on them trying so hard to make Prost the almighty French team?
Yeah, so firstly, again, I can only plug the Mobile Chicanes video on Prost because that's where I got a lot of my knowledge on Prost. And yeah, I can confirm they were dying for it to become the French team, firstly because Ligier had left, and also because they could finally have this relationship I mentioned before of Prost and Ligier. Well, Ligier's assets finally with Prost, but this time with Prost as a team principal. And it just didn't work out. And in 1997, actually, the car was quite good. Panis was doing well. And people thought, oh, that might be because of Prost. And then they realized that Prost was woeful as a team principal. It was a bit like when Thierry Henry has tried to coach teams. He's literally too good to be a team principal. Like, he sees things, and he was telling his drivers to do things that those drivers literally couldn't. So in the same way, when Thierry Henry has tried managing, I think now it's going better, but when Thierry Henry first started trying to coach teams like Monaco or Impact Montreal, he was trying to tell his team to see passes that they physically or mentally couldn't see. And that's what happened with Prost. He was sometimes, the team principal shouldn't tell the drivers how to drive. The team principal is there to direct the team, and he would start to get into small battles with the drivers, and at the same time people realized that he wasn't a great team principal, and the only reason they performed in 1997 was actually everything that Guy Ligier and the team there had been building in 96. And in the end it was just tragic. It really ended badly. Prost in France, he already had a bad image in France. That's something we didn't mention. For some odd reason, odd reasons actually plural, France did not like Prost. You would think that they would love him. They hated him. Part of it was apparently his mentality, which is really ironic from French people. They always they always hate French athletes who are very proud and self-centered. And then I'm like, yeah, but all of you guys are like this. So are you just jealous? Or I never get that. Like Mbappe, they don't like Mbappe because he talks too much about himself. They didn't like David Ginola in football because he was too proud. And it's like, what the hell's going on there? So Prost wasn't liked for that partly. And then secondly, Prost was known to be sleeping with everyone. Jacques Lafitte's wife slept with. Lots of the journalists slept with. The journalists' wives, if it was a male journalist, slept with. He was known to be sleeping with absolutely everyone in the F1 industry who was French. And for some reason that didn't sit well with the population. Now, any other population, I'm fine. We're talking about the French population there. We are talking about the country that is seen as the most open-minded and the holiest nation in the world, and they are complaining that their ambassador is a guy who's sleeping with everyone. So I never really got why Prost wasn't that popular, and somehow they seem to prefer Senna or um, the sports car drivers. And finally, now there's Canal Plus has made this mini series about Prost to rival the one that released on Senna on Netflix, and it's really good. So all of this to say, I really hope Prost's reputation recovers, because everything he did in Formula One, whether it was him as a driver or him as a team principal, was just seen badly in France.
Can I just make 2 points? First of all, I didn't even know about all that Prost sleeping with people stuff. He was just embodying the spirit of Franco Colapinto, I think. And secondly, maybe Prost should have done what Thierry Henry did before his managerial career. Obviously, he left Arsenal, joined New York, and then came back to Arsenal when they were doing awful. He should have done that. Come back at like 43, 44 years old and still be better than the Ligier drivers.
I mean, I think there has been attempts to sort of rehabilitate his image a bit, and people are reflecting on this and viewing him in a more honest light, such as with the publication of this documentary. Because I
Is it
think, as
all in
well as
French?
well, it's Canal Plus, so yeah, it's going to be a French one. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
they
I'll try
Does it have
to
English
get it and translate it for some people who might want to.
Okay.
Yeah, because again, another dynamic between the two is the fact that because Senna is dead, he becomes basically a martyr in many senses and has taken. I think if Senna was still alive, he wouldn't be viewed in as nearly as high regard. And I suppose recently some people have been turned off him with the whole, Senna 15 fiasco as well.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, you can also argue that because they were friends when Alain retired, that Senna would have contributed to Alain having a better image, because he'd have been like, no, he wasn't as bad as this, or it was just exaggerated rivalry, that kind of stuff.
they probably would they probably would get on quite well now. It would be similar to like Schumacher, Hakkinen. I mean, Hunt and Lauda famously got on really well, and that it's yeah, they'd probably be best buds. I don't know. Because they're the kind of I think they hold this special relationship because their careers and their lives are so intertwined in many ways. But yeah, so 2001 was a turning point because we lost Prost. Alesi also retired. And so at this point, it meant the only French driver still was Parnis, who ran until the end of 2004. But Renault, throughout the entire 90s, had been supplying engines to Williams and a few other teams, very good ones, actually, as well, because they were hugely instrumental behind Williams' dominance with the V10s designed by Bernard Dudot. And then Renault returned as a full constructor after buying out Benetton in 2002, and signed on a young Spanish guy who is some people might have heard of as well. And that kind of gave them a bit of a renaissance on the team front, but still, in terms of drivers, there wasn't much to be said.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the drivers they were there, as in there were talents that were popping up here and there. There was Sébastien Bourdais, who, again, I can only recommend the Mobile Chicane, our good friend, for his fantastic deep dive on Bourdais. But Bourdais had an incredible junior career, and then he just never gets that F1C that apparently he had with Arrows in 2002. But obviously Arrows, or 2 or 3, when did Arrows disappear?
2002.
Yeah, so he was meant to have a seat with Arrows for the year after they went defunct. And that's the reason he fucked off to the US, and he had to grind there for 5 years before coming back with Toro Rosso. Stéphane Sarrazin, another name that some people might recognize, who then became quite good in sports cars. Franck Montagnier, more known now for his cocaine habits than his F1 career with Super Aguri, another team that Peter loves.
He was more
But
of a Le Mans racer though as well. Montagnier, I think. He was,
exactly.
yeah.
So a lot of those French rejects from the early 2000s, they all went into Le Mans because Peugeot were doing really well at the time, and they all either joined Peugeot or Toyota, and had quite good careers in sports cars. But in Formula One, it just never, it just wasn't happening. And there were a few years between Panis and I'd say Grosjean where, yeah, you had Montagny just filling in for Super Gouveia, but it was just empty. And even when Grosjean came, I mean, he had that half season with Alonso in 2009 where he got absolutely smashed to bits. I mean, he was qualifying a second and a half behind Alonso, which at that time was not normal at all. So in terms of drivers, the noughties was a big blank, but Renault had really started to perform at that point. And in 2003, we know how well they did with a certain young Spaniard.
Yeah, one thing I will just go quickly to go back to the drivers front before we dig into the reincarnation of Renault. Here's a thought. Here's a thought. Because obviously the 2000s was a bit of a weak decade for French drivers. This is another video from Chicane that we can plug. Sebastian Loeb, he nearly made a switch to F1. Do you think that the trajectory of French drivers around that time could have been different had Sebastian Loeb come in towards the end of 2009?
Well,
I mean,
yeah,
it's hard.
yeah, I think that's obvious. And in 2009, yeah, that's when he was meant to race for Toro Rosso. And when you think about who raced for Toro Rosso in 2009, in the end, was it was he meant to come in 2009 or
Yes,
2010?
Abu
One of
Dhabi
those.
2009. The drivers
Yeah,
at the time were Sebastian Buemi and Jaime Alguersuari, taken over from Bourdais.
exactly. And the only reason it wasn't approved was the FIA said it would be too dangerous or it wouldn't look good for the integrity of the sport and all kinds of
He's a
bullshit
fucking
reasons. I mean,
four-time rally champion. What do you mean?
He's not going to crash. I mean, he'll tear the tires to shreds, but he's not going to crash. Like,
and also he had done Le Mans, so obviously Peter's joking about how he'd tear the tire to shreds, but he would have done really well because if you can do Le Mans and you can do rallying, you probably can do Formula One. So that's a guy who, by the way, he learned Le Mans on Gran Turismo 4 in his plane
Of
going
course,
to Le Mans in 2005 or 6. Yeah,
hmm.
he had his PS2 in the jet and he raced on a kind of rig for 5 hours and he was racing at Le Mans, well, testing at Le Mans like 2 days later. But if Loeb had done Formula One, it wouldn't have just been great for France, but just for motorsport because we've spoken about this before, but there are no transfers, inter-category transfers anymore, and we will never know how good he could have been. So definitely, it would have been a better prospect than Grosjean because we only had Grosjean for as like good French driver for a few years after that.
yeah. Well, quickly, just one last bit on Loeb. Obviously, he went on to be a 9-time rally champion and arguably the greatest driver, not just in rally history, but in motorsport history. Can we think of any other drivers who have won 8 or more titles in their given series?
Valentino Rossi,
I forgot about him.
there you go.
I think Alex Young has got several like Audi TT Cup titles in Malaysia or
We
something.
don't give a shit about those. Ben Sulayem has like 80 million Arab rally championship titles, but we don't give a shit about them.
Again, I know that Satoru Nakajima, he won the Japanese F2000 title several times. If
But
that
not
counts.
nowhere near
No,
8. Nowhere
yeah,
near
there's
8.
no like I can't think of anyone in IndyCar that has 8 or more titles.
No, AJ Foyt has 6 and Soda Scott Dixon. They're the most.
Yeah, there aren't really many.
V8 supercars, maybe there's a guy there.
Jeremy
There's
Whincup, maybe?
Yeah, Wink won it 7 or 8 or 9 times.
Who's
Between
that?
7
Is
and
it
9.
Peter? Everyone goes on
Peter
about
Brock.
Peter Brock. You know, he's one that people obsess over. He did V8 Supercars, didn't he?
I love Man TT, the Dunlop, Michael Dunlop, or however it's.
He's won it like
whatever.
27 times, hasn't he?
Oh,
over
what's
the-
his face?
Exactly,
Yeah.
yeah.
How many titles? Mike Halewood had a bunch of motorbike titles.
9 times. He had 9 times as well.
Nine times on motorbikes. To be fair. Yeah,
There you go,
there are.
Nedzo. You've been absolutely pummeled by
Mm.
our answers.
But there's a few. Yeah, I mean, it's always. I feel like we need to try this eventually. Is have a rally driver do F1, and because people talk about like that Rovanpera guy and other people, like maybe they could give it a go. Because the closest we've had to that is that Kubica did rallying and so did Kimi, and then came back, but they'd already done Formula One and grown up doing single seater, so it's not really the same.
The only guy who I know who actually competed in F1 and did rally was Vic Helford in the 1970s, but no one knows who he is.
Yeah, and the rally cars were like, well, he was doing like it was tarmac rallying, wasn't it, in the Porsche?
Oh, was it? I don't know.
Well, he did a little bit of rallying in like a Lotus Cortina, so it's not really the same, but yeah.
Okay.
And he was also not very good in Formula One. But yeah, we mentioned it briefly.
Yeah.
I was gonna say we mentioned it briefly. The other at that time, the only two drivers that came in really were Grosjean, who had a haircut even worse than Brendan Hartley's, but Bourdais was held in very high regard because he was a 4-time Champ Car champion. And he suddenly came into Toro Rosso, and everyone thought, "Oh, you're going to be great here." And then he gets shat on by Vettel, and it just doesn't. He had a lot of bad luck, but it just did not work. And I'm not sure if it's the groove tires he didn't like, or the engine, or because he didn't know the circuits. But just nothing came together for him.
Well, there's a couple of factors that I can suggest here. First of all, Sebastian Bourdais did win 4 Champ Car titles in a row, but that is arguably one of the worst eras of American open wheel racing in terms of competition. Robert Dornbos came third in a season one year, which isn't great. I think he even beat Will Power or Scott Dixon one year, which I don't know if Dornbos was just good in IndyCar or if it was just a really crap season or a couple of seasons. But yeah, he was unlucky. I mean, I'm pretty sure he did European Junior Formula, so he would have known most of the circuits. Obviously not like Singapore, but no one knew those. I do like there were races like, for example, Spa, where he was running third before the when the rain was coming down, but he just had bad luck. Monza, he started fourth. People don't forget this. Vettel started on pole, but Bourdais started fourth. He could have given those Toro Rossos were set up. He could have come third or second.
At Spa, when it started raining, Bourdais was third, and then it started raining, and Bourdais finishes like seventh or eighth.
He stayed out. Where Alonso pitted, but everyone else stayed out, and Alonso passed like 3 drivers at the last corner or something.
No, but he passed the exact same drivers that overtook him, so it was just extremely risky. But those last 2 corners are really fun to watch. But yeah, he pitted in fourth, finished fourth, but he passed 2 drivers on the start-finish line. But yeah, Bourdais, that was one of the races where he could have had a genuine podium, and he just got unlucky, just like in Italy.
But yeah, so Grosjean, his half year wasn't very good. He then spent 2 years out. I mean, Grosjean has one of the greatest junior careers of any driver ever. He's won basically everything.
Won GP2.
GP2 Asia, all the other stuff. He's won everything. Like, it's an exceptional junior career. And then he does come back in 2012. Renault, he comes back to what was Renault, but is now just Lotus, even though this whole time it had been Renault and they got the 2 titles of Alonso, but it's like it was owned by Briatore. The base was in the UK. It's Team Enzo. It's not really the same Renault of the 70s and 80s. In terms of drivers, I mean, Jev came in. His career was just kind of unfortunate in terms of timing, but since then he's done very well in Formula E and WEC. Charles Pic, one of the most boring, forgettable drivers ever, and is now the CEO of Dams in Formula 2. But then we did have Jules Bianchi, so another French fatality in the end, who did have a lot of promise and was the first ever member of the Ferrari Driver Academy and probably would have driven for them. But that just did not come to pass.
Just before we go into Bianchi, so just to not completely gloss over it, Renault's 2 titles in 05 and 06 were their only, the only fully French titles won with Alonso, and it is insane to think about. So France has only won 3 constructors championships in 74 years of the sport, 75. It's scary to think about, and it only happened. Well, in 2005, many will argue, it was were the regulations there to topple Schumacher, whatever they were, Briatore, the mass damper, and whatever, they helped Renault win, and then obviously in 06, they had probably a more legit win, a less controversial win against Schumacher and Ferrari. So yeah, that was the peak for French motorsport, but they had absolutely no French talent to put in there.
One thing I will say about, because we just mentioned Jev, Peak and Bianchi. This is one of my hot takes, and we'll get into Bianchi in a second. But I think that Jean-Eric Vergne was the better driver out of all of those three. He beat Daniel Ricciardo in 2012. He was faster than Daniel Ricciardo in race trim in 2013. Yeah, Ricciardo was better in qualifying, but Jev finished higher on average in the races. And then he beat Kvyat in 2014. Yet it was Ricciardo who got the promotion in 2014 and Kvyat who got the promotion in 2015. So I don't understand why he never got a Red Bull seat.
So firstly, we know Red Bull, they promote drivers based on peaks, not on average pace, and that was a reason. Secondly, Marco just didn't like Vergne, because apparently Vergne did. Again, what is it about French mentality? But Marco didn't like Vergne. And third thing is, Vergne in 2014, yes, he might have outpaced Kvyat, and in 2013 he was on average faster than Ricciardo, but he was literally starving himself. And he has spoken about it and said he was absolutely depressed because he was putting his entire livelihood on this in a way that even Nico Rosberg didn't in 2016. He was giving everything to it, and I think that Red Bull kind of saw that and was like, we can't have such an unstable driver be promoted. But I fully agree with you. I think Jev was unfairly treated in Formula One. There's no way he should have been out of the seat of the 2014. Formula E, we can slander it as much as we want. To win it twice is hard because you need some consistency and you need to at least understand racing. And he has been quite good with Peugeot in endurance racing as well. So, yeah, I do think Vergne was hard done by all of this.
And so it meant that when he fell by the wayside, we were then down to, well, for a brief period, just Grosjean. Then Renault came back again in 2016. But then we also eventually had the arrival of Ocon and Gasly, who were still here, and both of them went to Alpine, which is what Renault became. So we had, well, until the end of last year, we had an all-French lineup, which is somewhat disbanded. But yeah, this is kind of it's really not what it was 40 years ago in terms of French talent and prestige.
And they both got a win, to be fair, but both of those wins were quite fortuitous. We must say that Gasly, when he won in 2020, I think it was a breath of fresh air for the entire sport because at that point, everyone was really tired of Merck, Ferrari, and Red Bull absolutely dominating. It had been a few years since anyone from outside those teams had won. I think it had been since Kimi in 2013, right? That anyone outside the top three teams had won.
You could even argue that Lotus were a competitive team in their own right during that season. So you could even say it's back to Maldonado at Spain in 2012.
Exactly. So for a proper midfield team to win. So that was really nice to witness. And obviously, the French commentary by Peter at the start of the podcast showed how much it meant to France at the time. The commentator goes on to say 24 years since Olivier Panis. And that's how much they were waiting for it. And people thought maybe it might mean that Gasly gets a big move again, and he didn't. He just went to Alpine. Became kind of the lead driver now and has ousted Ocon, who also got a win thanks to very fortuitous circumstances, helped by Alonso to get the win as well. But then he did hold up Vettel. I always think, imagine the chaos online if Vettel had passed Ocon and then gets disqualified, and Ocon gets handed the win and Vettel gets stripped of the win. Both of those things, I think, could have led to a natural protest in the Formula One world.
Natural protest. That's the most Vettel thing ever nowadays.
But yeah, I mean the thing is, even this, like those two have split because Ocon's going to Haas, but also with Alpine, well, they're probably not going to be Alpine much longer because they're decided to get rid of their own engines at Viry-sur-Châtillon, where they're done. They're taking on Mercedes, so because Briatore's back, so it's either going to become Alcedes or they may just end up becoming high tech. So before long, we may have lost our only French team.
Bring Paul Aron into the car, not Jack Doohan.
But yeah, it's there is even though they're in a bit of a slump at the moment, it is broadly speaking a very illustrious history, and it's one that when you look at motorsport as a whole, is a huge contribution. And as we said, I mean, the French basically invented motor racing, and the Grand Prix is a French term, and all of that, but it just doesn't. There isn't the same, I guess, consistency that you get from Britain or even Italy in this regard.
Yeah, you could say there's another thing. There's a disproportionate number of the French drivers who have died. Your Severs, your I'm trying to think of Depayets, those kind of guys. And I mean, we briefly mentioned him, Bianchi. I mean, I don't think he was that special. People always talk about Monaco 2014, but I don't think that a race where someone finishes ninth out of 11, or whatever it was. I think it was like there was 13 cars that finished, but Kobayashi had major damage, which I'll get onto. And I think was it Gutierrez who finished 3 laps down or something like that. I can't exactly remember. But essentially,
he hit Kobayashi. Gutierrez hit the wall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then so basically, people talk about how that him getting that 9th place, but Kobayashi was on for that 9th place, and then I don't know how that move on Kobayashi wasn't penalised. He barges him out of the way, gives him severe.
He did get a 5-second penalty.
What do you say?
5 or 10 seconds.
He got a 5-second penalty, so he went from 8th to 9th. But
that was for a good infraction. That wasn't because of the accident. That was because of a.
Yeah, true. That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, I just like, don't get me wrong. Bianchi was not a bad driver, but people are saying, "Oh, he would have been in Ferrari with Charles Leclerc, his godfather." It's like, no, if he even got to Ferrari, it would have been a miracle. He would have stayed in Marussia for the end of 2014, possibly through 2015, because they didn't bring 3-car teams. And I don't think he'd have done well. I mean, his teammate would have been either Will Stevens or Roberto Merri.
I think he would have had a year at Ferrari at least, but I agree with you that he also doesn't strike me as this generational driver that some say he would have been. I always say, because at the time there were talks of Alonso retiring in 14, 15, 13, because at the time he was getting quite old. And Webber had just retired in 13, Massa was thinking about retiring.
Yeah.
I had always said Bianchi would be the next driver I would support. I was following him quite closely at the time. But he didn't have this Russell/Leclerc/ Norris wow factor at all, and I agree with that.
If you look at his junior career in GP2, his last GP2
that's
season,
the issue.
He was better. Yeah. He was beaten by Pastor Maldonado and Sergio Perez. In his 2012 Formula Renault 3.5 campaign, he got beat by Robin Freins. Like, don't get me wrong, Robin Freins, in terms of motorsport, is not a bad driver.
He should have been in Formula 1, by the way.
Fair. He's done well in Formula E. He's done well in endurance racing. Not a bad driver by any stretch. But if Bianchi was this future champion that we lost, why was he losing to him?
And his only teammate in Formula 1 was Max Chilton.
Yeah.
As well. So it's, yeah.
Who he didn't whitewash either. He beat him 14-7. That's not exactly Russell Kubica numbers.
And Chilton was definitely mediocre. He wasn't necessarily bad. He wasn't like Latifi or Sargent level. He was just mediocre and nothing.
But in terms of,
it's a bit weird on Bianchi. I feel like he gets the Senna treatment in that because he died, people view him better than I think he should be, and that's no disrespect to his legacy. But
if he wasn't Leclerc's godfather, people would care much less about him as well.
Yes.
If there was no connection with the Leclercs.
Yeah, I agree.
And that's the thing with Prost, that they ended up with more legacy in literally every other category, I would say. Other than MotoGP, they had a big issue in MotoGP until Quartararo, who's Fabio Quartararo is not exactly the most French name out there. But in rallying, they dominated with Citroën Loeb, in Ogier later on in sports car. Yes, they were really toppled by Audi dominating the 2000s, but they did win with Peugeot, and they have a big legacy with sports car racing. But just in Formula 1, apart from Prost, the heyday seemed to be gone, and there are a lot. There's always at least 1 or 2 French drivers in Formula 2, Formula 3 coming through the ranks. And obviously Hadjar will be there next year, but look, Hadjar is definitely not, I would say, world champion material. He is front runner material, I will say that. I can see him being at Red Bull, getting a few podiums, maybe a win, but I wouldn't see him winning, and that's the issue France has. They have a strong karting scene. They have lots of circuits, as Peter said, lots of circuits that aren't used anymore, but it just doesn't seem to lead to anything major.
To be fair, it would be quite funny if Hadjar did become a really good world champion. As much as I don't like him because I think he's a big-nosed French gimp, it would be really funny if the one driver, like in football, the one driver that they have that does really well isn't actually properly French, just like they have in the football.
It's, I mean,
Well,
it's
from different origins, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's indicative of the changing image of France in the modern era that both him and Ocon are of partial Algerian extraction. But there isn't many options because he's going to Formula One. But then there's Victor Martins, who is one of the
Awful.
Alpine juniors,
Awful.
who is flopping like mad. But
I think he's
Teo,
quite good, but
yeah,
I think he's quite good, but he's already thinking about hypercar, so he's already understood
yeah.
that. No one's gonna-
Anyone who takes Oliver Behrman out of a race on purpose isn't good in my opinion.
I mean, Teo Pourchaire has been. I mean, he won Formula 2 eventually, but he's been exiled to Super Formula and probably won't come back from that. There's not really much else.
I do think there's
Like,
that
yeah,
French sponsors have an issue at the moment because the way Bourdais, Pourchaire, obviously then it's 20 years apart, but I feel like French sponsors should have gotten Pourchaire on the grid somehow. Like, there's no way he shouldn't have been on the grid, and it's the same for Bourdais at the time. Again, this is just speculation, but I feel like the backing is not as strong. And Martin, the only reason he's so old is because he had no sponsors to take him up to Formula 3. So sometimes there are state-funded issues like this, but yeah, can only hope that it leads to more.
I mean, last year the only French Formula 3 driver was Sami Megatounif, who's going up to Formula 2 this year. But otherwise, there's just not. I mean, French Formula 4 is still a very active series, but there's just not many of them happening, really. But yeah, so it's a I suppose to wrap it up, it's one of the big names, but just seems to they're always there in one form or another, but do just seem to sort of come and go in prominence, I suppose.
Yeah, I'd agree with
both
that.
in terms of teams and in terms of golden generations, they've had teams very present teams in different periods, but there's just not that consistency needed to lead to anything concrete. And yeah, it is kind of a disappointing record for them, really.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
But yeah, if you like this, just let us know if you want us to cover any more other nations' history in Formula One.
Argentina.
You've been listening to the DRS Train podcast. We're on YouTube and Spotify, and you can find us on Instagram and X at the DRS Train podcast. Make sure to tune in for our next episode. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.
Bye-bye.